So I would say to the government that if they get to the end of their 5-year term of office and they haven't done something to improve the healthiness of the food in this country, they will suffer at the ballot box.
I believe the government will regret this lack of urgency, as have many former ministers in positions of responsibility before them.
Hello, I'm Baroness Walmsley and I was the chair of the Food, Diet and Obesity Committee, which produced a report in October 2024. In this episode of Unpacking the Evidence, we're going to look at the response of the government and the food industry to the recommendations in our report. In response to the committee's report, the government told us that, first of all, they are going to implement some of the strategies and policies of the previous government, such as implementing the proposed advertising ban of unhealthy foods up to the watershed of 9 o'clock on television and at any time online. And they're also reviewing the soft drinks industry levy, which is commonly known as the sugar tax. And they're going to introduce a ban on selling those high-energy drinks to young people. Since the government's response, they have established the food strategy under the aegis of DEFRA, and that really also involves other government departments, such as the Department of Health and others involved with food strategy. Now, that has hardly got underway yet, but they have established a cross-ministerial group and also an advisory board, which concerns me a little because it contains a majority of participants from the food industry, although there are some very good people on the board as well.
To our main recommendation that the government should develop a comprehensive, long-term strategic approach to oversight and regulation of the food system, backed up by legislation. Despite Wes Streeting saying he would steamroller over the food industry if it didn't improve, the government is falling into the piecemeal and voluntary action trap again. We heard that food is an equalities issue. The poorest 20% of people would spend 45% of their family income to comply with the national dietary guidelines, rising to 70% if they have children. Therefore, they suffer the consequences in lower life expectancy and more years in poor health. On average, today's British children consume less than half of the recommended amount of fruit and veg, but twice the amount of sugar.
The food industry themselves have welcomed the government's response, and that gives me concern as well because the government wasn't committing to an awful lot. As far as I can tell, all they've done is lobby the government to try and avoid any mandatory regulation. When we began our work, we decided that it was necessary to look at how we got where we are with a very problematic obesity and public health crisis. And so we looked at what previous governments had done to address the issue, and they'd done quite a lot. They'd set up a lot of policies, about 700 policies, in fact. And we asked some researchers which ones had worked and which ones hadn't, and if not, why not? And what they told us was that they were too much based on personal responsibility. We all know that a lot of people haven't got the choice or the freedom to choose healthy food, either because of the food environment itself or because they simply can't afford healthy food. And policies also were piecemeal. They didn't have a coherent strategy. And also a lot of the targets were voluntary rather than mandatory.
But the government says it will, quote, continue to review the balance between mandatory and voluntary measures, unquote. But, my lords, the voluntary target of reducing sugar by 20% resulted in a measly 3.5% reduction. Is the government serious about saving the NHS, improving children's health, and growing the economy?
We've relied on the good faith of the food industry for far too long to voluntarily reformulate their products. We've told people they must eat healthier, but this report lays bare our findings, our failings, and it demands a radical shift in our policy. We must simply change the food landscape, encourage companies to produce healthier food, focus on children, and ensure all are able to access a healthy diet.
Profit is driving force behind this crisis. Reforming products to cut sugar or salt risks losing the additive edge and with its sales. Voluntary pledges like the failed public health responsibility deal have proven, my lords, ineffective. Without legal framework and enforcement, the industry will not change. The report cites that £6 billion annual burden on the National Health Service is due to obesity. Money that could be fund schools and could fund school meals. As we know, school meals are now not made in schools anymore. They're made in different places and brought to schools. And also, those are not good food. And further, the school budgets are run by schools now, and sometimes if they need money for other issues in the school, they cut school meals. It's an easy cut without anybody noticing. So we really have to be quite tough about school meals and what children are being fed in at school.
One thing the committee was determined to do was to have a laser focus on healthy diets for children, because not only are taste preferences set very early in life, such as the taste for sweet foods or salty foods, but also the healthiness of the life course is set when children are very young and they develop healthy strategies, preferences and habits. That's why it was important to us to look at the quality of food in schools, the availability of free school meals for those who need them, and the quality of foods for infants and babies.
On a daily basis, children in particular are bombarded by food offers and advertising, encouraging them to buy and eat much more than they need. This food revolution has had a profound impact on children. They have grown up with an abundance of artificial and industrially produced foods, and some have little or no experience of natural or home-cooked food. The statistics are stark and becoming worse. In the UK, over 20% of children are already too heavy, and around 10% are already obese by the time they start primary school. As the Food Foundation's most recent report states, children in the most deprived fifth of the population are over twice as likely to be living with obesity as those in the least deprived fifth by their first year of school.
Will this strategy encourage both children and adult communities to grow the food they can eat? Will allotments, for example, be protected from land to build on? If this is cross-departmental, are we actually going to start engaging the public with the very food that they need throughout the course of their lives? We know many schools, for example, support gardening and growing things, which helps to introduce children in a most positive way to food that will be part of their lives. And will this strategy improve the population's understanding of basic nutrients in food so that people know what to look for when they're shopping? Will they understand the labelling? Are all these things that all small in their way, but which contribute to the way in which people address food and the way in which they see the food that appears in their kitchens?
Where do a known number of people all eat at once, every day, all in one place, allowing a relatively easy calculation of how much fresh food needs to be prepared, minimising wastage and transport? Schools, where it's also very much needed. The committee heard how not only are nearly 1 in 4 of our children clinically obese by age 10, they're stunted by malnutrition. UK children are up to 9 centimetres shorter than their peers in Northern and Eastern Europe.
The committee felt it very important to recommend that the government should set its food policies based independently of the food industry. And the reason for that is that the government's objective should be the health of the nation, whereas the food industry's objective, quite legitimately, is to make a profit. Of course, the government will want to engage with industry when it comes to the practicalities of implementation of their policies, but the policies should be independent.
I'd just like to use my few minutes to talk about one of our recommendations, which was about the extent to which the industry is involved in the policy of food at the moment. Take, for instance, SACN, the Scientific Advisory Commission on Nutrition. It is the main advisory form to the government on food policy, and you would think it should be unbiased. But you'd be wrong. Of the 16 members on SACN, 14 of them directly or indirectly take money from the industry. They might brush it aside by saying, I declare my interests. But in fact, if you take money, I believe that it changes minds.
The government announced the advisory board for its food strategy. That strategy that doesn't mention reducing unhealthy food. On the board is one solitary farmer. No one who cooks fresh food, no one who's an expert in school meal provision, not even a biodiversity and conservation expert, even though one of the stated aims of its strategy is to work out how to reduce the impacts of our food system on the environment. Another of the aims, economic growth. Economic growth could mean the encouragement of innovative local and community SMEs and family farms, British businesses who employ locally and supply locally. But no, the board are almost all representatives of multinational industrial foodstuff manufacturers and retailers, as is its secretariat. The people whose businesses are the antithesis of what a healthy food strategy needs. The strategy says it aims to ensure, and I quote, that our largest manufacturing sector can realise its potential for economic growth. Manufacturing. That's how this government sees food. Not in terms of growing, not preparing, not cooking, not health, not environment. Manufacturing. And that's the sort of thinking that's caused successive governments to fail the citizens of the UK, fail to stop the ever-increasing illnesses from poor food.
The junk food giants should be regarded as a leech on our public finances, a free rider that is not paying for the externalities that they create, and a threat to both our national security and to our public finances. My Lords, that's why the government response is so disappointing. It calls for, and I quote, coordination and collaboration, which is essential. I just don't agree. My Lords, what we need are hard regulatory guardrails. We need to put health promotion at the centre of the Food Standards Authority priorities. We need fiscal intervention starting with a sugar tax. We need a monopoly investigation by the CMA. And we need to start taking the junk food industry out of the conversation, as we have done with the tobacco industry and we should do with the pornography industry.
Although the committee was tasked with looking at foods high in fat, salt and sugar, we were also asked to look at ultra-processed foods. That's foods that have been produced in a factory. And we found that quite a difficult area because although there's a lot of evidence that people who eat a lot of ultra-processed foods very often have food-related health problems, scientific evidence on the exact causality of that is not yet complete. There are lots of studies that show that ultra-processed foods can push out whole foods from the diet. But people are not quite sure whether it's because they're energy dense or because they're what people call hyperpalatable, or whether they're just very highly attractively advertised and available everywhere and are cheap. So what we proposed to the government was that they fund more research, that they ask the Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition to keep a watching brief on the evidence on ultra-processed foods, and then, of course, respond to that when it comes to national policies. We also felt that it was quite legitimate to change the dietary advice to say to people, it is inadvisable to eat a high proportion of ultra-processed foods in your own dietary pattern because not only do we not know the effects of the ultra-processed, also there's a very big overlap between foods that are ultra-processed by whatever definition you use and foods that are high in fat, salt and sugar and very high in calories.
Our food system is broken. Over 60% of UK adults are overweight or obese, and diet and related illnesses are consuming our national health billions each year. But my Lords, let us be clear, it is not merely a matter of personal choice. This is a systematic failure driven by the food industry, dominated by multinational giants, companies like Nestle, Pepsi-Cola and fast food chains, as we found out from Blackpool. That food on our shelves in the high streets with ultra-processed foods. These products, packed with sugar, salt and unhealthy fats, make up over half of the average British diet, one of the highest rates in Europe, Why, my lords? Because they are cheap to produce, they have long shelf lives. How long have they been on the shelves or in the warehouses by the time they get to anybody's home?
Yeah, indeed.
And they are engineered to keep us coming back for more.
Yeah.
This is not an accident, my lords, this is the business model. Through relentless lobbying, they have stalled or diluted policies meant to protect public health.
We had a very interesting debate with support for our recommendations from across the House. I was somewhat disappointed, but not totally surprised, by the response from the Minister. The government is a new government, you have to give them that. And she said that they had only been in place for 6 months when they were required to respond to our recommendations. And they didn't appear to be ready to really commit themselves to anything. They were asking for time to do more research and more consideration of the options, etc.
Now, I have heard the committee's concern that it takes too long to make new policy commitments. And I was reflecting on this when we were preparing for this debate. And when I have, I take that point. However, to the point about the government's response, which was made not many months after coming into government, and that response was that was made in January of this year was started, of course, as soon as we received the committee's very welcome report. But being realistic, the government wasn't ready to make firm positions on introducing or indeed rejecting many of the committee's more specific recommendations. And I think for me that perhaps explains or illustrates some of the reasons behind the government's response.
I'm very pleased to hear that the Noble Baroness intends to keep some of our recommendations under review, and I can assure her that there are many people in this chamber today who will also be keeping an eye on her and the government. We will be following up in detail how many of the things that we're proposing are really put into place by the government. So it really is encouraging to hear some of the things that she has said, but there really are some things that we need to watch very, very carefully indeed.
What I would like to say to the government is that all the evidence is there in our report. We took evidence from a very wide range of people with relevant interests and experience. And the evidence is very, very clear that the government needs to be bold and act fast and do something to make the food in this country healthier. And indeed, it's what the public wants.
I'm puzzled. The government agrees with our diagnosis of the problem. They say in their response to our report that people are eating too much calorie-dense, highly palatable food, commonly known as HFSS, high fat, salt and sugar, or junk food for short, and as a result, obesity rates have rocketed in recent decades. They go on to say that this rise in obesity has adverse effects on health, well-being, and the economy. And they also say there's a need to reshape the food environment that has been an important causal factor for the rise in obesity. My Lords, having read these introductory paragraphs of the government response, I was ready to enjoy learning that, having agreed with our diagnosis, they would also agree with our proposed solutions. And these solutions were based on many months of hard graft and over 1,000 pages of written evidence from experts. But instead, my Lords, the government, as we've already heard, rejected nearly all of our recommendations, as indeed they did reject the recommendations of the inquiry that I chaired a few years ago on food poverty, health and the environment.
Unhealthy food has an enormous impact on children. 10% of them in this country are already obese by the time they go into primary school, and that rises to 20% by the time they leave primary school, and even 30% when they're teenagers, relying not only on the food that they get at home or the food that they get at school, but also the food that they pick up from the fast food joint down the high street. The committee heard that voluntary targets hadn't worked in the past. For example, There was a voluntary target of reducing the amount of sugar in foods by 20%, but all we got was 3.5%. So that's certainly not success, is it? But the one that did succeed was the soft drinks industry levy, commonly known as the sugary drinks tax. And that was a tax on the amount of sugar in soft drinks. Now, the purpose of that was not to gather the tax in, it was to persuade the manufacturers to reduce the amount of sugar, and it succeeded. But at the same time, the amount of sugar in the average family's shopping basket actually increased. So although there was less sugar in the drinks, there was more sugar in a lot of other things. And for that reason, we felt that we need a mandatory target to reduce sugar and salt in foods, because actually salt is a great health risk. It causes hypertension, it causes a lot of fatalities. So we suggested a mandatory target for reducing sugar and salt for large companies, manufacturers and retailers. A lot of evidence that we heard suggested that the food industry is not paying for the problems that it causes. And by that I mean that bad food causes a lot of health problems, but it's the NHS that has to pick up the pieces, and you and I as taxpayers are paying for that. One thing the government has done is slightly strengthen the national planning framework so that local authorities have increased powers to prevent the establishment of new fast food outlets near to schools or where children gather. The problem is there are already a lot of them.
Since coming into government in July, we have indeed laid secondary legislation to restrict advertisements of less healthy food and drink to children on TV and online from the 1st of October this year. And my noble friend Baroness Walmsley recalled that hadn't happened previous to this government, and referred to the strong voice of industry against this measure. And I certainly do remember when in opposition and standing at the dispatch box opposite, urging action, and I am glad that we have done this.
Although the committee were quite disappointed by many things in the government's response, we understand that the government's top priority is its growth strategy, and there's a lot of opportunity to achieve both growth, reduction in the costs to the NHS, and at the same time, healthier food.
And finally, the government's growth objective. We have almost 3 million people of working age out of the workplace because of preventable illnesses caused by obesity. My lords, sick people can't work. They don't pay taxes, but they do qualify for benefits, adding £4 billion a year to the government's existential economic problems, according to Frontier Economics. But it's not the patient's fault. It's the fault of our broken food system, and the government could fix it if it wanted to. Wes Streeting said recently, our sick society is holding back our economy, and that is why we should act. The committee heartily agreed. Because the annual economic cost of overweight and obesity is £98 billion.
The government's main focus in this area at the moment is the food strategy, which is hosted by DEFRA. It's very important that this is successful, and it's also important that it's transparent. I think people want to know what direction it's going in so that we can bring in more voices to inform the strategy. And I think there are a lot of the food campaigning organisations that would very happily bring in their citizen panels to comment on the direction that the government is taking to ensure that it produces healthier, affordable food for everyone. When I heard some of our very compelling evidence that we heard from the people to whom we reached out, people who were having difficulty in feeding their families healthy food with the income that they had or the availability in their area, when we heard from teenagers who begged us to protect them from the deluge of advertising of unhealthy food, it occurred to me that what the committee were doing was probably one of the most important things that I've ever done in 25 years in the House of Lords, because It's about people's lives. It's about babies' lives who don't have a lot of choice in what they eat. It's about everybody's lives, and it's really about protecting the NHS and its viability to save us all from the health problems that come from bad food. So I really hope that the government will implement some of the strategies that we have recommended. Even if they don't do them immediately, they should be doing them over the next 5 years. And if they don't, well, we'll continue to be disappointed.